Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I'm joined by Christoph. Hey, dude.
Hello back at you, dude. Very glad to be here, and glad everybody else is here too. Thanks.
In the summer of 1922, the Black Sea glimmers under a restless sky, and the town port of Samsun, perched on the northern coast of Anatolia, goes about its daily rhythm. Dockworkers unload crates of kerosene, tobacco merchants tally their inventories, and small wooden fishing boats bob along the harbor wall. From a distance, it seems peaceful, almost ordinary. Yet beneath this calm surface lies the tension of a region on edge. A tension born from rebellion, retreat, and the crumbling remnants of empire. In just a few hours, this quiet coastal town will be engulfed in fire. The echo of naval guns, Greek and American ships in the bay, will send shells crashing into the port, warehouses and homes. Civilians will scramble for cover as plumes of smoke rise over the rooftops. It will become one of the most controversial and least known bombardments of the Turkish War of Independence. The Bombardment of Samsun, June 7th, 1922. To understand this moment, we must first understand the world it emerged from. By 1922, the Ottoman Empire was gone. Its defeat in the First World War had shattered centuries of rule. In its place, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's nationalist forces were fighting to build a new Turkish state from the ashes of collapse. Their struggle, known as the Turkish War of Independence, was fierce and fragmented. A war fought not only on battlefields, but along coastlines, across trade routes, and in the minds of nations desperate to shape the post-war world. Samsun was not just another port. It was a lifeline, the primary artery through which weapons, ammunition, and supplies from the Black Sea flowed inland to fuel the Turkish resistance. Every crate that arrived on its docks, every cart that rolled from its warehouses, strengthened the nationalist cause against the occupying Allied and Greek forces. And that made Samsun a target. The Greek Navy, operating in the Black Sea as part of the broader Greco-Turkish conflict, sought to strike at this logistical heart. To the Greek command, Samsun represented a hub of defiance, a port that kept the nationalist war machine alive. To the local population, it was a symbol of survival. And to the foreign powers watching from offshore, including the United States Navy, it was a point of delicate diplomacy, a testing ground for influence and restraint. On that fateful day, a squadron of Greek ships appeared off the coast, their guns trained on the city. They claimed the attack was meant to destroy Turkish ammunition depots, hidden inland. Yet, in truth, the bombardment would do little to harm military supply lines, and much to devastate civilian life. In the harbor, a handful of Turkish defenders manned a single cannon. They fired 25 rounds in reply to more than 400 shells unleashed from the sea.
Golly.
The sky darkened with smoke and dust as flames rose from the petroleum depots. The governor's office crumbled under direct hits. Houses, shops, churches, and orphanages suffered indiscriminate damage. Civilians fled through the narrow streets as explosions echoed off the hills. When the guns finally fell silent, the port was scarred, but the Turkish logistical system remained intact. Ammunition depots 3 miles inland were untouched. The nationalist movement continued its advance. The Greek fleet's show of force meant to cripple resistance, became instead a symbol of futility, a grim reminder that firepower without strategy achieves little more than destruction. Yet the story of Samsun is not merely one of bombs and shells. It is a story of presence and absence. In the uneasy waters of the early 20th century, the presence of naval might projected into a coastal town, the abundance of understanding about how such force could shape or fail to shape a nation's destiny. Among those offshore observers was the United States Navy, represented by destroyers stationed nearby. Though they did not take part in the bombardment, their role as witness and later as assessors of the aftermath would add a layer of diplomatic complexity. Admiral Robert L. Gormley himself came ashore that evening to see if any Americans had been hurt. His visit, brief but symbolic, underscored how closely American eyes watched the shifting balance of power in the Black Sea. The New York Times would soon report conflicting accounts of what had happened. Greek officials insisted the shelling targeted ammunition stores, claiming minimal casualties. American naval officers, however, reported otherwise, up to 90 civilian casualties. Entire sections of the town reduced to rubble, and no sign that any military targets had been struck. Truth, as in so many wartime stories, was the first of the casualties. In this episode, we will retrace these events, why Samsun was chosen, how the attack unfolded, and what it revealed about naval power in the chaotic aftermath of World War I. We will look at the political motives, the tactical realities, and the human cost. And we will explore how one 3-hour bombardment, largely forgotten by history, still echoes in the study of literal warfare and maritime diplomacy today. Because sometimes history's most telling lessons do not come from the grand battles, but from the brief flashes of fire that illuminate the limits of power.
This is something I am totally unfamiliar with, and so I'm very excited to dive in. I was a little bit curious when you said that it was the Greek and the Americans at first, but I can see us being observers. I know we've been around to a couple of different conflicts just to see how things unfold. This was a pretty tumultuous time right after World War I, especially with the toppling of the Ottoman Empire. It'll be interesting to see how we got from there to where we are today. So let's jump in.
Let's get underway. To understand why Samsun was attacked in June 1922, we need to step into the strategic geography of the Black Sea, a crossroads where empire, commerce, and revolution all collided. Samsun was not just a town on the map, it was a gateway. Through its port flowed grain, tobacco, fuel, and most crucially, arms. By 1922, the Turkish War of Independence was reaching its decisive phase. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, his nationalist army, had regrouped in Anatolia and was preparing to drive out the Greek expeditionary forces occupying parts of western Turkey. Supplies from abroad, rifles, ammunition, and explosives were critical to that effort. The port of Samsun, positioned midway along Turkey's north coast, became one of the main arteries through which these materials moved from the Black Sea into the heart of Anatolia. Every crate unloaded on these docks carried more than cargo. It carried the promise of a new republic. The ships came quietly, sometimes from Soviet Russia, sometimes through intermediaries, carrying crates marked as machinery, fuel, or grain. Once ashore, the goods were sent inland on narrow roads, bound for the nationalist strongholds around Ankara. The Greeks knew this. Their naval intelligence had tracked the growing traffic through the port and believed Samsun was sustaining the resistance. From their perspective, the bombardment was an act of military necessity, a strike intended to choke the Turkish supply chain and weaken the nationalist forces pressing against them in Anatolia. But there was more to it than strategy. In the months before the attack, reports reached Athens of Turkish raiding parties on the Black Sea. Small Turkish sailing boats and gun-armed trawlers, little more than converted fishing craft, had been intercepting Greek merchant vessels, seizing their cargo, and sometimes even commandeering the ships themselves. One especially embarrassing episode involved the Greek ship Enosis, which was captured by just 6 Turks, 1 officer and 5 soldiers, and sailed into the Turkish port under the nationalist flag. These raids struck a nerve. They were not just humiliations. They challenged Greek control of the sea. And the Aegeans might have been Greek-dominated. But the Black Sea was another matter. Its shallow coastal waters and narrow straits favored stealth, not might. And for every captured Greek vessel, nationalist propaganda grew stronger. In Athens, naval planners were furious. The raids were seen as an affront, and the bombardment of Samsun became a way to answer that affront with overwhelming firepower. It was not only about choking supply lines, it was about reasserting control, sending a message, and perhaps restoring a sense of deterrence after a series of stinging embarrassments. Yet even at the time, there were doubts. Could a short naval bombardment truly stop the flow of arms through Samsun? The Turkish ammunition dumps were known to be several miles inland, beyond the effective range of ship-mounted guns. And the port itself, though small, was resilient. Destroying a few warehouses or barges would hardly cripple a network that spanned hundreds of miles and relied on dozens of local middlemen. Still, the decision was made. At approximately 1500 on June 7, 1922, Greek and American vessels in the harbor opened fire. The Greek ships took the lead, with the American destroyers maintaining a neutral posture, though their very presence blurred the lines of neutrality in the eyes of Turkish observers. Over the next 3 hours, more than 400 shells rained down on the town. The defenders of Samsun, mostly local gendarmes and volunteers, had a single cannon. Just one.
Whoa.
They managed to fire 25 rounds in retaliation before being silenced by the overwhelming barrage. The Greek naval gunners aimed for what they believed to be ammunition dumps and military installations. But the geography of Samsun betrayed them. Smoke, dust, and the tight layout of the town made precise targeting impossible. Shells meant for storage sites struck civilian neighborhoods instead. Warehouses caught fire. The governor's office was reduced to rubble. Turkish and Greek homes alike burned together. Even the Armenian church and orphanage were damaged, an echo of the region's layered human tragedy. By evening, the fire still smoldered. Turkish reports counted 4 dead and 3 wounded among civilians. Later, American naval officers visiting the scene would estimate far higher casualties, perhaps as many as 90. And yet, for all the destruction, the strategic impact was nil. The Turkish logistical system was untouched. The ammunition depots 3 miles inland were unscathed. The nationalist forces continued their campaign. In the aftermath, newspapers scrambled to make sense of it. The New York Times printed conflicting accounts on consecutive days, first quoting Greek officials who claimed few lives were lost, then citing American officers who described significant casualties and widespread damage. Even in print, the truth of Samsun was contested. But What could not be denied was this: the bombardment of Samsun revealed the limits of 20th century naval power in literal warfare. Against an undefended town, ships could unleash devastation. Against distributed supply networks and resilient nationalist movements, gunfire was little more than noise. In the following days, Admiral Robert L. Gormley of the U.S. Navy went ashore, accompanied by a pharmacist, to check on possible American casualties. They found none. What they did find was a town shaken, charred, and confused. A place that had briefly stood at the intersection of international politics and local tragedy. And as the Greek fleet withdrew to Constantinople, leaving the coast behind, Samsun began to rebuild. Its docks would soon return to work, its streets to commerce, its people to survival. But the memory of those 3 hours from 1502 to 1800 would remain etched in local memory as the day when foreign warships turned their guns on a Turkish town. The question that remains is not whether the bombardment achieved its purpose, but whether it ever had one to begin with.
This whole conflict is very interesting to me because when you mentioned the Black Sea at the top, I was like, okay, I get an idea of where this is taking place. But then you mentioned Greek forces, and that was confusing because Greece is not on the Black Sea. It's in the Aegean Sea. You got to go through, like you said, Constantinople or Istanbul at this point to get there. And so I'm curious, one, how many different navies are just kind of hanging out in the Black Sea, and how do they get there? Or is this a matter of the decline of the establishment in the Ottoman Empire such that maybe there was a ton of naval traffic that was able to pass through where maybe it couldn't before? It's interesting to see, and I think we've seen this in a couple of our previous episodes, as far as how one port city can be the absolute lifeline for a nation and what it's trying to accomplish. And when we see that here, they are fighting as insurmountable odds, it seems, against what appears to be an overwhelming enemy. But it's, in spite of the tragedy that is inflicted upon them, they're able to keep pushing. And that's, I don't know, to me that's inspiring. It's like when the chips are down, you got to do what you got to do, and that's what they're doing.
Yeah. When the smoke cleared over Samsun, the shells had stopped falling. But the real battle, the one of words, headlines, and diplomatic cables, had only just begun. In the early summer of 1922, the Black Sea was already a crowded and tense stage. Greek, Turkish, British, French, and American ships all shared its waters, with each their own missions and their own interpretations of neutrality. The bombardment of Samsun sent a ripple through every capital that had an interest in the region. Let's begin in Athens, where the Greek government found itself defending an action that, depending on who you asked, was either a legitimate strike against enemy logistics or an indiscriminate assault on civilians. The official Greek statement, released within 48 hours of the attack, claimed that the bombardment targeted, quote, ammunition depots used by Turkish forces in violation of international law. The Greeks maintained that they had fired only at military objectives, and that any civilian damage was both unattended and exaggerated. But there's a problem. The American Navy had been there, and its officers saw something very different. Reports from the U.S. destroyer stationed nearby contradicted the Greek version almost immediately. American observers claimed that the ammunition depots, the supposed targets, were located several miles inland and appeared untouched. What they did see, however, were fires spreading through the civilian quarters of Samsun, warehouses in flames, and terrified residents fleeing the waterfront. Those reports traveled quickly. Within days, dispatches reached the U.S. Embassy in Constantinople, and from there, they were telegraphed to Washington. In an era when the United States was carefully balancing its neutrality in post-World War I Reconstruction period, the idea that American citizens or even American businesses might have been endangered by Allied actions was deeply concerning. One building in particular drew attention: the warehouse of the American Tobacco Company, which had sustained minor damage during the shelling. Though no Americans were injured, the incident touched a nerve in Washington, which was still cautious about being entangled in the volatile policies of the Near East. The New York Times, reflecting that anxiety, published two conflicting stories, one on June 11th and another on June 12th of 1922. The first echoing the Greek narrative, downplaying the damage, few lives lost, ammunition dumps destroyed, mission accomplished. The second citing American naval reports, painting a bleaker picture, around 90 casualties, much of the town damaged, and no evidence of any legitimate military targets having been hit. The confusion was symbolic of the broader moment. The world was still adjusting to a new media environment where instant reports, telegrams, and correspondence could shape diplomacy almost as much as diplomacy shaped events. In Constantinople, still under Allied occupation at the time, British and French officers viewed the bombardment with mixed feelings. Officially, they were Greece's allies, part of the coalition that had backed Greek claims in Anatolia after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. But privately, many British observers considered the attack reckless. To the British Admiralty, naval bombardment of a largely civilian port, especially one with neutral assets, risked provoking broader backlash, particularly from the Americans, whose influence in regional trade was growing rapidly. More than that, it risked eroding the already fragile legitimacy of the Allied presence in the region. Meanwhile, in Ankara, the nationalist capital, Mustafa's government saw in the bombardment an opportunity, not a setback. Turkish newspapers immediately labeled the attack as proof of Greek desperation. They printed images of the destruction in Samsun and framed the bombardment as a symbol of foreign aggression and Turkish resilience. The official statement from Ankara was defiant. Quote, "Our ports may burn, but our resolve does not. Each shell fired into our homes strengthens the will of the nation." That line, simple and direct, was reprinted across Anatolia and became a rallying cry in nationalist speeches for weeks afterwards. It's easy to forget how much symbolic power an event like this could hold in 1922. The Turkish War of Independence was as much about psychology as it was about territory. Every foreign bombardment, every invasion, every newspaper headline from Europe or America that seemed to disregard Turkish suffering became fuel for the nationalist movement. The Samsun incident, small though it was in military terms, reinforced the idea that Turkey stood alone against the world, an idea that galvanized popular support for Ataturk's leadership and the nationalist army's coming offenses in Western Anatolia. At the same time, international humanitarian groups began asking questions. Was the attack a violation of emerging conventions on the protection of civilian populations? Were neutral properties like the American Tobacco Warehouse legitimate targets if they stood near alleged military sites? These were new questions in the early 1920s, the beginning of what would eventually evolve into modern international law on warfare and civilian protection. Samsun, though rarely mentioned in legal textbooks, was part of that early conversation. As for the U.S. Navy, Admiral Robert L. Gormley, then a young officer, took it upon himself to investigate the aftermath personally. That evening, around 8 o'clock, he went ashore with a Navy pharmacist to look for wounded Americans and assess the damage. What he found was a town still smoldering, families searching for lost relatives, and a population stunned by the sudden violence. Gormley's report, which would later circulate through naval channels, emphasized that while U.S. interests were mostly unharmed, the moral cost of the bombardment was high. His measured words foreshadowed a theme that would echo through American naval policy for decades. The awareness that firepower without intelligence and restraint could achieve tactical success, but strategic failure. By the time the Greek ships returned to Constantinople, the diplomatic waves were already spreading. The incident strained relations between Greek officials and allied diplomats, fueled anti-Greek sentiment in Anatolia, and raised uncomfortable questions in Washington about the role of American ships in proximity to Allied bombardments. For most of the world, the story faded within weeks. Just another headline in the long, weary aftermath of World War I. But for those who lived in Samsun, and for the sailors who witnessed the bombardment firsthand, it became part of a much deeper lesson in the age of industrial warfare. Even small towns could become battlegrounds, and truth itself could be the first casualty.
As I listen to you, the more I hear, the more I realize, not a lot has changed.
Yeah.
And headlines change frequently. I mean, if you get in trouble nowadays and you make headlines, just wait a week or two. You could just fall out of the zeitgeist just as quickly. And this seems to be no exception, with the exception of the people living there, like you said. And I think if you're there and you see the tragedy for what it is, that makes a huge difference. The 1800s and early 1900s here really showcase the American Navy presence with respect to trying to protect American interests abroad. And that has been a fascinating discovery for me as we've gone through this. They're there, and as part of the Allied side, they're occupying the Ottoman Empire. And so I know that's kind of a nearly unmanageable task, just because it was already simmering from the Ottoman rule. But then to exacerbate it with the Greek bombardment in this case, it's just like, why? You could be such a boon to these people. You could actually help them and kind of guide them through the shackles of the Ottoman oppression. And now all you're doing is making yourself an enemy to these people. And I don't know if that's a lesson that should be taught frequently to the militaries of the world, but you're right. If you have a tactical success but a strategic failure by doing it incorrectly or being blasé about who you hurt, it can ultimately lead to your downfall. And I think that's what it seems like we're tracking to here, knowing what I know about the modern world.
In war, lessons often arrive too late. They are not written in textbooks, but in ash and debris. In the silence after the guns fall quiet, the bombardment of Samsun was one such moment, a microcosm of what could go wrong when political ambition, military technology, and human judgment intersect on uncertain seas. While the shells fired by the Greek naval vessels numbered fewer than 400, their echoes reached far beyond the coast of the Black Sea. For the navies involved and for observers watching around the world, the operation illuminated a series of uncomfortable truths about the nature of maritime warfare in the 20th century. Let's unpack those lessons strategically, tactically, and morally. In 1922, naval bombardment was still an art, more than a science. Long-range gunnery was improving with optical rangefinders, spotter aircraft, and range tables, but accuracy remained limited, especially against targets close to civilian areas. The ships off Samsun fired from beyond visual range, often at coordinates provided by outdated maps or rough estimates. Their targets, alleged ammunition dumps, were believed to be near the town's edge. But even a minor error in bearing or elevation could mean the difference between striking a depot and striking a marketplace. And that's precisely what happened. Eyewitnesses described shells landing among homes, warehouses, and public buildings. The governor's office, churches, and shops all hit. Over 40 houses were destroyed or damaged. And the petroleum depot erupted in a spectacular fire that consumed thousands of canisters of kerosene and gasoline. This outcome underscored an uncomfortable reality. Even when technology promises control, war remains inherently imprecise. The commanders believed they could conduct a surgical strike. Instead, they performed what history would later call area bombardment.
Mm-hmm.
That illusion that machines could deliver clean, decisive violence would follow the world in later wars. From the bombing raids of World War II to the drone strikes of the modern era, the belief in technological precision has always been shadowed by human error and the unpredictability of battle. Samsun was an early reminder of that truth. The United States did not intend to be a belligerent actor in this incident. American naval forces were in the area for observation and humanitarian duty, not for combat. Yet by proximity and association, they became part of a violent act. This blurred line between observation and participation has haunted naval diplomacy ever since. Admiral Gormley's actions, landing ashore to check for American casualties and assess the aftermath, were acts of compassion and professionalism. But his very presence there raised diplomatic eyebrows. Was the United States, even unintentionally, complicit in the Greek bombardment? Did its ships signal tactic approval simply by being nearby? In an age before instant communication and public transparency, even perception could shape policy. The U.S. government had to navigate a delicate balance, condemning civilian casualties without openly rebuking its wartime allies, preserving neutrality without appearing indifferent to human suffering. The same dilemma would replay many times throughout the 20th century, from U.S. neutrality patrols before Pearl Harbor to modern multi-international coalitions where shared seas blurred political lines. It's easy when recounting events like this to talk in terms of tonnage, firepower, and tactical objectives. But behind every statistic from Samsun, behind every round fired and structure damaged, were human lives. 4 Turkish civilians were killed, 3 more wounded, families lost their homes, or 90 civilians were killed. The Armenian church and orphanage sustained heavy damage. Merchants watched their livelihoods burn as thousands of barrels of fuel ignited and rolled into the sea. Those who survived described the bombardment not as a battle, but as chaos. Sudden, senseless, and terrifying. To them, there was no grand strategy, no geopolitical justification. Only the terror of watching shells fall from a sky that moments before had been quiet. The moral reckoning that followed, though brief in the international press, left a deeper impact on naval thought. Could firepower ever be justified if it produced so little tactical effort and so much civilian harm? This question echoed decades later in the drafting of the Geneva Conventions, in the establishment of laws distinguishing combatants from civilians, and in the rules governing modern naval engagements. Samsun's civilian suffering, rarely cited directly, was part of the lineage of lessons that led to those humanitarian frameworks. The aftermath of the bombardment played out not just in diplomatic cables, but in newspapers. The New York Times, the Athens Messenger, the Constantinople Herald, and countless local Turkish papers. Each publication told a different story. To the Greeks, it was a measured strike against enemy logistics. To the Americans, it was a troubling episode requiring investigation. To the Turks, it was an atrocity against civilians. And to the wider world, it was simply confusing. In this cacophony of narratives, truth became another casualty. Each side framed the incident to suit its political needs. Long before the term information warfare entered the military lexicon. This manipulation of perception of who fired first, what was hit, and why demonstrated that in modern conflict, the battle for public opinion can be as decisive as the battle at sea. The bombardment of Samsun occurred decades before television or the internet, but its press coverage foreshadowed the modern cycle of disinformation, propaganda, and strategic messaging that now accompanies every act of war. For the Greek Navy, and indirectly for its American counterpart, Samsun revealed that passion of powerful ships did not automatically translate into effective power. Despite commanding heavy guns and steel hulls, the attackers failed to achieve their objectives. The Turkish ammunition dumps located miles inland were untouched. The Turkish logistical system, which the bombardment was meant to cripple, remained intact. In other words, the operation demonstrated the limits of naval firepower against inland, dispersed, or concealed targets. It also illustrated the dangers of overconfidence, a reoccurring theme in naval history. Naval historian James Holmes, reflecting on similar lessons, once wrote, "The sea is the domain of strength, but not of certainty. Every shell that leaves a gun barrel carries the chance of shaping history, and the equal chance of missing it entirely." That sentiment applies perfectly to Samsun. The ships of 1922 were technological marvels for their time, yet they could not achieve strategic success against a determined and adaptive enemy fighting on home soil. If the Greeks and their allies learned about the limits of naval bombardment, the Turks learned something very different: the psychological power of endurance. For Turkish nationalists, the bombardment became a moral victory. It proved that even under attack from modern warships, the spirit of the new Turkish nation could not be broken. The town rebuilt quickly. Local officials and citizens organized relief for the wounded, and the story of the bombardment spread through nationalist newspapers as an example of Turkish heroism. In Mustafa Kemal's Ataturk's speeches that year, the tone shifted subtly from defensive to defiant. He began to describe Anatolia not merely as a homeland under siege, but as a forge of unity, where foreign aggression tempered the national will. In that sense, the shells that fell on Samsun contributed, however unintentionally, to the creation of the modern Republic of Turkey. A century later, the bombardment of Samsun might seem like a footnote, a small incident in the shadow of far greater wars. But in the details lie timeless insights about power, restraint, and the human dimension of warfare. The operation reminds us that technology cannot replace judgment. Power without purpose invites error. And even small conflicts can carry moral and strategic weight far beyond their size. In today's world, where drones, cyber weapons, and precision missiles are heralded as tools of clean warfare, Samsun's lesson endures. There's no such thing as a clean war. Every decision to fire, whether from a destroyer's gun in 1922 or from a satellite-linked console in the 21st century, carries human consequences that no calculation can fully predict. The bombardment of Samsun was a brief event, less than 3 hours of gunfire on a quiet June afternoon. Yet its lessons ripple forward through time, touching everything from the ethics of modern military engagement to the psychology of national resistance. When we look back at that day, we are not simply studying history, we are examining ourselves, our capacity for restraint, our thirst for control, and our struggle to balance might with morality. Because the truth is, every bombardment, no matter how brief, tells two stories, one of destruction and one of revelation.
Well said. I think you said quite a lot there, and I'm trying to compile all the things that you made me think of. Number one, I never thought about what led up to the Geneva Conventions on War. And I think this being, as you mentioned, perhaps a key element of that is pretty significant. And one of the things that my wife tells my children very often, and sometimes me, is that it's not the mistake, it's how you react to the mistake. And I think, I'm not saying that this was an accidental bombardment by the Greeks, but when you can make a correction such that this type of thing happens less and less over time, that's a good thing. I'm also impressed with, I guess everybody just loves their home, and the will to, you just fought a huge war, you've liberated yourselves from an oppressive empire, and then now all these other countries are going to try to move in and bully you, and it's like, no way. We didn't do all that just for you to roll over us. And I think this has to be a moment of pride, I think, for the Turkish people. And then, yeah, you said it so well as far as what the balance is militarily. And in recalling the stories that the U.S. Navy has been involved with, it seems to be a recurring theme. It's like, yes, we have this might, but what is the right thing to do? How do we handle this in a way that is most appropriate, that achieves the objective, but safeguards lives? Like even back in the Civil War episodes when you were talking about how commanders would surrender immediately because the lives of their troops were much more important to them than any fort. And I think it's nice to see that recurring theme in our Navy.
History has a way of whispering through time, sometimes faintly, sometimes with startling clarity. The bombardment of Samsun was a short, violent moment on the shores of the Black Sea in 1922, but its echoes have carried forward for more than a century. As the smoke cleared from the waterfront and the last ships pulled away towards Constantinople, few could have guessed that this brief naval action would become a lens through which historians, strategists, and naval officers would later explore the ethics and evolution of maritime warfare. Today, we'll trace those echoes from the immediate aftermath in 1922 to the modern lessons still shaping the world's navies today. When the bombardment ended, the town of Samsun lay scarred and smoldering. The once bustling port with its rows of warehouses and kerosene depots became a blackened shoreline. Local Turkish authorities immediately began assessing the damage. Over 40 homes destroyed or damaged. A governor's office leveled, and several churches and orphanages partially ruined. The fires burned late into the night, fed by thousands of gallons of spilled kerosene and gasoline. But in the days that followed, something remarkable happened. A community began to rebuild. Turkish civilians, merchants, and dock workers returned to the harbor, clearing wreckage, patching walls, and restoring order. Reports from surviving eyewitnesses describe a haunting scene of unity. Despite their losses, the people of Samsun refused to abandon their town. They saw the bombardment not as defeat, but as proof that the struggle for Turkish independence had entered its most determined phase. Meanwhile, the diplomatic world moved cautiously. The United States, though directly uninvolved in the shelling itself, faced uncomfortable questions. Admiral Gormley, who had gone ashore to check for American casualties, filed reports that contradicted the official Greek narrative. He noted up to 90 civilian casualties and significant property destruction, even as Greek spokesmen insisted the attack had targeted only ammunition dumps. The New York Times, publishing those conflicting accounts on June 11th and 12th, reflected the confusion of the moment. No side could fully control the story, and in that uncertainty, the seeds of diplomatic tension were sown. For the Greeks, the bombardment symbolized resolve, a show of naval dominance in the Black Sea. For the Turks, it became a rallying cry, evidence of foreign aggression against their sovereignty. And for the Americans, it became a sobering reminder that neutrality is never absolute when your ships share a battlefield. Fast forward 100 years. The name Samsun rarely appears in naval textbooks. Yet, the lessons it offers are surprisingly relevant to the modern era of warfare. In the early 21st century, we find ourselves once again debating the role of naval firepower, the ethics of bombardment, and the meaning of precision in warfare. The bombardment of Samsun, though fought with steel guns and analog maps, prefigured many of these dilemmas. Consider the illusion of control, a concept that still shapes modern naval doctrine. In 1922, commanders believed they could target specific depots without endangering civilians. In 2025, naval planners often place similar faith in satellite-guided missiles or AI-enhanced targeting systems. Yet history reminds us that every weapon, no matter how advanced, carries uncertainty. The same tension between power and responsibility that haunted the decks of the Greek cruisers off Samsun persists today on every modern destroyer and submarine. As one naval historian observed, quote, Samsun was not just a bombardment. It was a parable, a story about the human desire to master chaos and the inevitable reminder that the sea, like war itself, refuses to be tamed. The strategic failure of the bombardment also forced naval thinkers to reconsider the purpose of shore bombardment itself. If hundreds of shells could not disrupt a logistical network, what was the value of such operations?
Exactly.
In the decades following, this question shaped how navies around the world approached amphibious warfare, blockades, and coastal bombardment tactics. During World War II, for example, American planners studying historical operations cited earlier bombardments like Samsun as cautionary tales. They recognized that naval gunfire, while powerful, was rarely sufficient on its own to achieve decisive outcomes. Success required combined arms, intelligence, and coordination, not just firepower. In that sense, the bombardment of Samsun became an unseen stepping stone in the evolution of naval doctrine, a failed operation that quietly informed future success. Beyond strategy, the legacy of Samsun lives on in the moral dimensions of warfare. The tragedy of civilian loss, 4 dead, 3 wounded, or 90 casualties, and, hundreds displaced, revealed a simple but profound truth. Naval guns cannot distinguish between combatants and the innocent. This realization became part of the conversation that led decades later to the refinement of international humanitarian law, including the principles that protect civilian populations in conflict zones. In this light, Samsun can be seen as one of the early sparks that pushed the world towards recognizing the human rights dimensions of naval warfare. Even now, the bombardment continues to resonate symbolically. For Turkey, it stands as one of the last foreign attacks on its soil before the final victory of the Turkish War of Independence. For naval historians, it remains a study in contrasts between technological might and moral frailty, between victory and futility, between the will to destroy and the responsibility to restrain. And for sailors, whether Greek, Turkish, or American, it is a reminder of the ocean's impartiality. The sea bears no grudges, but it never forgets. It records every error, every act of courage, every shot fired in anger. One can almost imagine those ships of 1922, their guns cold, their decks slick with rain, slowly disappearing over the Black Sea horizon, leaving behind not triumph, but a question that still troubles the conscience of every navy. When we command power so great, how do we ensure it serves not destruction, but purpose? As we close this episode, let's return to the Black Sea itself. The waters off Samsun are quiet now. Cargo ships glide over the same routes once patrolled by warships. Children play on the beaches where shells once fell. But beneath those calm waves lies memory. The memory of a bombardment that changed little in its day, yet still speaks volumes about the nature of power, responsibility, and the human heart at war.
When you started talking about what this episode would be about, I was very perplexed. I didn't know how significant this incident would be. I had never heard of it before. I was only somewhat aware of the geography, and it's just like, what this is going to unfold to be. But now, I do feel really well informed about not only the event, but the ramifications of the event, the persistent problems we see even 100 years later with different competing, I would say nations in that case, but even people with different perspectives trying to hide or showcase their agenda in, like, you see that today. And of course, they're going to protect themselves. Of course, they're going to try to shine the best light on whatever action it was that they took. And one of the things I love about history, even in an event as precise as this in this little time frame, is you see that people are the same throughout. And how they react, how they respond. It's helpful to know that, yeah, hey, that's what we do. But we can also learn lessons from this thing and try to be better. And when you talk about how people approach warfare now and not just indiscriminate bombardment of areas, that's an improvement. That's really good. I'm glad people took the appropriate lessons from this tragedy and that we can move forward to prevent tragedies like this going forward. So that's very good. And thanks for bringing this up. This is really cool.
All right, we're going to end this episode like we like to end all of our episodes by honoring one of our fallen heroes with the help of HeroCards.us. And today we want to honor Specialist Devin J. Kuhn. His hometown was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Served with the U.S. Army, Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. His date of sacrifice was January 31st, 2018. Camp Rila Armed Forces Training Center, Warrington, Oregon. He was 24. Devin James Kuhn was born and raised in Northeast Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he graduated from Archbishop Ryan High School in 2013. Kuhn was a devout Roman Catholic and an active outdoorsman, athlete, and musician. Enlisting in the U.S. Army in April of 2015, Kuhn attended one-station unit training at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he graduated from the Basic Airborne Course, the Ranger Assessment and Selection Program 1, and the U.S. Army Ranger Course. He was assigned to Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment at Joint Base Lewis McChord, southwest of Tacoma, Washington, in December of 2015, where he served as a rifleman. Specialist Kuhn was deployed to Afghanistan in November of 2016 in support of Operation Freedom's Sentinel. He earned the Combat Infantryman's Badge after participating in various special operation missions against multiple terrorist networks throughout his tour. He also took part in training exercises, including live fire and mountain warfare drills. Kuhn's father, James Kuhn, told the Philadelphia Inquirer he was he was proud, but very humble about his service. He didn't advertise that he was a ranger. If it wasn't for his haircut, you wouldn't have any idea he was a ranger. On January 31st, 2018, Devin Kuhn lost his life from injuries sustained in a shooting accident while training at Camp Ryla in Oregon. He had just turned 24 and had married his wife Brittany only a month earlier. Specialist Kuhn's award and military decorations include the Army Achievement Award, the National Defense Service Ribbon, Afghanistan Campaign Medal, Army Service Ribbon, the Expert Infantryman's Badge, the Parachutist Badge, and the Ranger Tab. He also received the Combat Infantry Badge after his deployment and was posthumously awarded the Army Commendation Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster and an Army Good Conduct Medal. Battalion Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ken Burgess commented, Devin loved God, his wife, his family, and he loved being a ranger. He was taken from us too early in a tragic accident, but we endeavored to honor his life and service to his nation. So, Specialist Devin J. Kuhn, we thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take us out.
All right, Captain. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for showing up to this episode and listening through this really interesting historical bit. I think I say this often, but I do mean it. I did learn something, and I hope you did too, and I hope you come back and learn something new. If you want to get a hold of us, for whatever reason, let us know that, hey, I was really interested in this event in Samsun. There's a couple of ways you can do that. You can email us. The email address is usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on X Twitter. The handle there is @USNHistoryPod. And we also have a Discord server if you want to jump in and say hello and just, do whatever podcast listeners do on their favorite Discord server. You could do that there. Always, it would be very helpful if you told a friend or a family member or coworker, even a long-lost relative. It's like, hey, you know what? So glad to see you again. By the way, have you heard the U.S. Navy History Podcast? It's not bad. We see the numbers go up. It's very encouraging, and we really appreciate that you're doing that. Feel free to rate and review also. That helps us as well.
And with that, we're going to wish you all fair winds and following seas. Bye, everybody.
Bye.